This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion.
The great thing about this podcast is I often find myself in conversation with these tremendous achievers, legends in their fields, and I was not aware. I was not aware because perhaps I just was not studied enough. But then again, the world is a big place. Sometimes it's difficult to know all of the achievers, even if they are some of the highest achievers. My guest today is one of those individuals, Steve Blank, Silicon Valley entrepreneur, really the guy that set the lean startup movement in motion. I don't know how many different companies he has started, some of them quite successful. He has gone on to teach entrepreneurship at Stanford. And the part that I'm really jealous about, because I've not had a chance to do this and I just think it would be fun, the college commencement addresses he gives. Such a down-to-earth perspective. And big picture, I love the fact that Steve really started essentially with nothing. So for all of you out there that have excuses, I gotta have this, I gotta have that, you're just telling yourself a story. So if you want to be inspired by a guy that made it, a guy that just picked himself up and said, let's go do it, then give this episode a listen. If you're convinced that you can't do it because you were born into the wrong family or you don't have enough money or whatever other excuse you have, please, please, please delete this podcast from your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or however you receive podcasts, because Steve will definitely not help you. But again, if you're open-minded and you want to get ahead, let's jump right in with Steve Blank. So listen, way back in the day, getting my MBA, I had a very entrepreneurial bent. And I thought, well, gosh, this is where I need to be to really take the next step. And I kind of showed up at my MBA program. It was at Florida State. And I kind of had a bad ponytail. And I remember the first day of class meeting a guy who became a friend. And he was just Mr. Clean Cut. He was in the blue blazer, 3 gold buttons, the whole 9 yards. And within short order, we were talking about maximizing fannies in the seats on planes. And I was like, whoa, are we going to get to any entrepreneur or anything? We really never did. And I thought, and this would be a great place for you to start with, your expression about being an entrepreneur, that it's an artist. I think you're the first person I've seen say that. It struck me today and I was like, damn, I wish somebody would have explained this to me when I was in my 20s, this artist aspect. Then it feels okay to be an outsider. But when you don't know that, you kind of feel like, oh, I got to do all this other stuff, my CPA, all this, and you go crazy.
Right. It took me a long time to realize, and here I'm talking about founders, meaning the people who actually start companies. If you think about it, at least the Elon Musks and the Steve Jobs and the Jeff Bezos, those types of founders see something that you and I don't. They hear things that you and I don't. They can imagine things that are past what's visible or tangible. And you start thinking about their life is confusing and they break things and their path is never clear from that vision. Half of it is a hallucination and it's not. You go, well, what other career is like that? And then you kind of go, well, that's what painters do. You and I look at a blank canvas and Van Gogh saw Starry Night. Or in Michelangelo's studio, we would have seen a 12-foot block of marble, and he already saw the Pieta. When asked, how did he do it? He said, I just removed the stone around it. Or Beethoven's, who was deaf, but already heard the Fifth Symphony. Those are people who exactly have the same career path as founders. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, but they're able to create not only something out of nothing, in a good number of their cases, they could recruit other people. Beethoven could recruit an orchestra to play this unplayed stuff, and Steve Jobs could recruit people to quit well-paying jobs when all he had was an idea. And the summary is, being a founder is the world's shittiest job, but it's also the world's best calling. And if you're not called to be a founder, if you think it's a job, that there's a job spec and you'll go to work and you'll get money and you get to build a company, you're confused, my friend. Startups are not founded by accountants. This is not a task-driven, process-driven thing, not in its early days. Hopefully your job is, because a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for repeatable and scalable business model. Hopefully you'll get it to someday at scale, but that's not what it's like in the beginning. It started by artists.
Now, you mentioned a second ago, you named some well-known names and looking at the blank canvas and saying that you or I would not see what they ended up painting. But you are a guy, to get you to talk a little bit about yourself, and let's go back in time.
Well, that could take 37 minutes.
When you started to understand, how old were you? What was the trigger when you started to understand, you know what, I really like this blank canvas thing. This appeals to me. This is calling me. When was that moment in early Steve that something happened?
Well, my life was kind of a slow little reveal, kind of like there's a scene in a book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest where one of the characters you could just read as the fog is lifting around his head. And that's happened to me. I had an immense disadvantage in early childhood, which turned out to be an immense advantage as an adult entrepreneur. And then I grew up in a massively dysfunctional family where survival was a day-to-day thing. Completely chaotic. I never knew who would be home or whether it would be food, or latchkey kid was kind of an understatement, a description of what was going on. Lots of drama and sometimes lots of just abandonment. But in fact, that chaos actually taught me as a survival skill to be able to shut out anything that was extraneous except for survival. And it turns out that founders who come from dysfunctional families have an edge in running startups in their early stages. Why? Because that type of chaos is exactly what happens in an early stage company. Nothing is predictable. If everything that happens off script freaks you out because you grew up in a repeatable and predictable family, like in a normal household, then you get a little unnerved. So number one is I had that advantage, never understanding that it was an advantage to much later in my life. Two is I discovered a couple of other skills courtesy of the U.S. government. Oh, I must have been 18 years old in the middle of a war zone in Southeast Asia and realized that A, I operated well in chaos, but B, I could ingest a lot of data quickly, meaning I wasn't smart, or maybe I was, but it wasn't school smarts. It was being able to look at a situation or read a lot of stuff or whatever and kind of grasp it fairly rapidly. And more importantly, recognize patterns in all that data. Fast data acquisition, operating in chaos, and pattern recognition. Those are the three skills, only ones I think I've had my entire career. I think I learned what they were over time and honed them, but that was it. And I learned that in the middle of Southeast Asia.
I'm going to take you back there, but I first want to take you back to a comment that you just said about startup founders talking about the disadvantages of perhaps a chaotic home life. That's obviously, when you say that, I'm not sure what data you're working with, but I'm sure a lot of personal experience and a lot of conversations with like-minded people across Silicon Valley and across the world, frankly. Is there any example you might like to share or that you can share of a common brother in arms, so to speak, that had a kind of like-minded experience that you had as a youth? Someone we might not know or someone we do know, or just share the big picture of it?
If you listen to Elon Musk talk about his father, even today, you could hear how painful it is for him to even bring that up. You hear about others as well. I'll let their stories be told by them, but at least Musk has kind of alluded to in public some of the others. I think if you go through a set of founders you might know as kind of some of the craziest ones, some of that craziness comes from their upbringing. And by the way, the good news is about growing up in a dysfunctional family as a founder is, yet everything I said. The bad news, and I live this both in myself but working for people like this, is when the company scales. Let's say you're successful and now gets repeatable and requires process and the same thing every day. These types of founders throw emotional hand grenades into their own company to keep the chaos going on. It turns out they don't know what to do with a calm, collected process. I mean, it's why their business relationships often mirror their personal relationships where they're kind of divorced 5 times. And the reason why is that they don't know what a stable environment feels like. And you see that in a subset of founders that actually develop some very interesting companies.
You must have had this unique ability that, I mean, a lot of people can take in data, but sometimes when people are presented with lots of data, they get emotional or something triggers, and then the limbic system kind of gets at them and they can't take it all in. They get all anxious or this or that. You must have just had an ability to kind of, as you mentioned, going back to early childhood, to just stay calm. And then it just seems very easy to you, whereas other people, they're kind of like, hold on, how does Steve do that?
And again, calm is the wrong word. It's actually tunnel vision. By the way, it reduces your EQ dramatically. It's almost like Asperger's. But if you grow up trying to survive, then you only focus on, do I have food? Do I have shelter? Okay. Is anybody hitting or throwing stuff at me this moment? And so you're able to focus on just that stuff. Again, not every founder goes through that. Therefore, you develop those skills kind of in the line of fire, so to speak, and you discover whether you want to be a founder or can survive. But that is kind of a model of what goes on in the early days of a startup. Your co-founder quits, or your best customer decides at the last minute that they were not going to pay you, or the toilet stopped up and you're also the head of facility. I mean, all that stuff happens. And if you're not prepared for that, if you just think you're going to sit there writing code, or is the building big enough for the bags of money that will come in, you're going to be surprised. The other thing I should point out, since we're talking about my early days, that I did, which was so counter of, your listeners might have heard this, in the military, people say, never volunteer for anything. It turns out I did exactly the opposite. I volunteered for everything. I want to say that again. I volunteered for everything. I showed up when other people went, are you out of your mind? And I'd say 50% of the time, yeah, I was volunteered for cleaning toilets or doing KP, meaning kitchen patrol or whatever. But the other half of the time, I got some extraordinary opportunities because people would look around and go, the only one here is blank. All right, you over here. And ended up doing some amazing things that I was completely unqualified for or shouldn't have been able to do. I was there. And there's kind of a heuristic that says showing up is about 80% of the effort, is just show up a lot. And that's been another theme through my career, is I just showed up a lot.
Was that just pure curiosity? I mean, just the desire to learn?
That's maybe another theme. People talk about what makes great founders and entrepreneurs, and they talk about agility and resilience and yes, yes, and yes, but they don't mention often curiosity. And as you just pointed out, for me, I was always curious about stuff I just didn't know. And your listeners should understand, I now teach in some great universities, but I never graduated college. Therefore, my whole life has been trying to catch up for all the stuff I never learned. And by the way, when I was in school, since I was in survival mode, I don't think I ever did a day's worth of homework in my life. It was everything outside of when I left home that I was trying to catch up on. I knew how to read and maybe use a calculator, but that was about it. So my whole life has been curiosity about things I didn't know, about things I should have known, but also everything from particle physics to supercomputers to microprocessors and military intelligence. And I've started companies in all of those areas.
You're opening up Pandora's box here, because when you say you never graduated, I don't think you're lamenting it because the experience and path you went down made Steve, but you've got students in front of you that have done everything they're supposed to do every step of their life since age 6 to get to Stanford. And they've got this professor in front of them with all this great experience and all this achievement who did an entirely different path. That's an interesting contradiction, huh?
Yeah, they should ask for a refund.
Everyone's going to be like, oh, man, turn him off.
Yeah. In hindsight, my wife is the one with the MBA in the family, and one of my daughters is a master's degree in healthcare. And I see my students come in and leave with incredible preparation. And if I had a choice between, and I often do, counseling students, should I drop out and start this company or should I finish my degree? I go, I will personally break your kneecaps if you drop out of school now. You're end way through, you're a good student, get the damn degree, and you could do this thing next year. It's very hard to go back. But I was an outlier. I was not the model. I was an extreme outlier.
Why? Why are you not the model? Why are you not the model?
Because the survivors get to tell the tales. I mean, there are tons. I'd say 100 to 1 of Steves who dropped out of college and ended up working at Walmart. With all due respect to people working at Walmart, I ended up in a much different career. You don't do that and then end up teaching at Stanford. It was a set of lucky breaks. And then, as I said, a set of just brain chemistry and environment that drove me to do different things. But I think the odds of having a career like mine by dropping out of high school versus finishing college is, I would not be betting on that. I'd be betting on finishing college wherever you are. Then using that and using those skills to kind of, if you want to build an entrepreneurial career, go doing that. I don't regret what I've done. In fact, I'm now at the age where my peers kind of look back and go, coulda, shoulda, woulda, wish I did, or what. I don't have a single day of that. None. I lived my life exactly. I mean, it was the world's greatest adventure. But I definitely do not recommend it for everybody because it is not a path that guarantees success. I threaded the needle a million times. Some of it was skill, some of it was luck. Some of it is, as I said, you show up a lot, you make a lot of your own luck, but it was one hell of a ride.
Do you think you would have been just as happy if you would have had 95% less success, but you would have gone down this process and path of experimentation and explore? No, you wouldn't.
Hell no. I mean,
the achievement of the.
I mean, think about it. 8 startups, 4 IPOs, 2 craters so deep they have their own iridium layer. I mean, retiring at 45, figuring out what the next couple careers were. I mean, the whole list of things you do in life where you kind of. And to me, by the way, I should tell you, on top of all that stuff, the best thing I ever did was married a great woman and had an extraordinary, still have a 30-year marriage and 2 great kids, and whose best thing they could do for holidays is go like, okay, we're coming home. That was even better than my entrepreneurial career. And most of that I could credit my wife. But trying to raise a family and have a normal family and in the middle of 8 startups, that was right up there among achievements.
Hey, before I move you out of this early, Steve, you mentioned Asperger's in our conversation so far, and you've talked about tunnel vision as one of your secret weapons, so to speak. Speak to Asperger's. I brought up the name with you earlier, Vernon Smith, who is well known to have Asperger's. And when I interviewed him for the first time, I was in his college office at George Mason University, and we were setting up all this lighting and equipment. I was like, Dr. Smith, are we going to be disturbing you or whatever? He looked at me straight in the eye and he goes, Michael, I will not know you're here. So it was like this great kind of focus. How much of an advantage has that been in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Some of the perhaps great achievements that have come out of Silicon Valley have perhaps come from guys that could very well likely be on the spectrum.
I mean, if you really think about who some of them were, I think you might say a good number of them had that as a advantage/disadvantage of being able to shut down things that were irrelevant to them at the time. As I said, I found that being an advantage for me. I can't speak for others, but there is kind of almost a trope here in the Valley that we're kind of breeding a generation of Asperger's because most of the great engineers are like that. But I think that's above my pay grade to make those judgments.
So let me shift you into, as we lay this foundation, something that I've seen in your work, which I think is really interesting, and it's kind of builds on what you've established so far. If we were to look at, let's say, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, these founders and what they do, and the people that come next, the Steve Ballmers and the Tim Cooks, this is quite interesting. And it gets at something you've said earlier, too, where some of the startup founders, they like the chaos and they want to keep the chaos going. And then perhaps the company gets so big, the board gets control, they tamp things down. But we're starting to realize that perhaps, and maybe Apple's a great example, I'll let you run with it, that you lose something when you bring in the manager and you lose that kind of creative chaos.
Well, I think that happens all the time. If you remember what the role of a founder is, the role of a founder, and different people articulated that is describe it differently, but for me, if you think of that, a startup is just a temporary organization. The goal of a startup is not to become a startup. Believe it or not, it sounds obvious, but it's actually an insight. The goal isn't to be 12 people in a garage. The goal is to be 12,000 people. But to go from 12 to 12,000 requires different skills at different stages. We really didn't understand that well in the 20th century. We do now, is that the skill set you need in having the idea and creating the vision and creating a reality distortion field and building the team, and that's a different set of skills than running 12,000 people. It's obvious. Now it's obvious, but it wasn't then. By the way, that person who can run a 12,000 person company, I will guarantee you couldn't find the bathroom in a startup. They'd be lost. Their staff is larger than the startup. Very few founders, though we'll talk about now, well, that's kind of changed, ever became the people who ran the company when it scaled. When you did that, you tended to hire people who were world-class executors. What I mean by that is people who understood how to build processes and procedures and OKRs and KPIs, which are fancy words for how do we measure success, and understood financial models. And instead of building products, they built how do we squeeze the last nickel in financial, which was all made sense when you got to scale. But they lost the passion of customers and products. And in fact, my test is when you ever see product announcements from large corporations, see who's demoing the product. Do you remember who demoed the products when Apple was around with Steve Jobs? Who demoed the products?
Steve.
Yeah. Who demos the products today?
I have no idea.
Well, that's right. That's the answer. If the CEO doesn't have a passion for products, the odds are that's not where innovation is coming from. Might be great strategy or financial management or supply chain optimization, et cetera, but the next big thing is not coming from there. Maybe that's okay. Maybe you could do innovation by committee, but they're now competing with startups that for the first time have more money than they do. That's never happened in the history of commerce. Never. It was never the case that you would have a startup raising $100 million in a Series A. Holy cow. What planet is this on? I don't know if I answered your question, but different skill sets at different times. That kind of changed about 5 or 10 years ago with a firm called Andreessen Horowitz, a venture firm in Silicon Valley, started by two entrepreneurs, one of them, Mark Andreessen, who created the first commercial internet browser at a company called Netscape, basically had this insight that technology was shifting so rapidly is that bringing in a senior executive team in a technology company after the first release of the product guaranteed that the company wouldn't have any more innovation. So why don't we figure out how to kind of bring in that management expertise underneath the founders and kind of skill them up? That is like Sheryl Sandberg did for Mark Zuckerberg. That's kind of been the current strategy in technology companies now, is how to keep the founders around. The problem is we've now, the pendulum has swung way to the other way, and we're starting to see a lot of excess.
WeWork,
Uber, et cetera. Again, what happened is Andreessen started a kind of a competitive thing that says, well, we treat our founders differently. Come take your money from us. It was a race to the bottom of how little control VCs would eventually have. They used to be the adult supervision. In fact, we're now running essentially venture capital used to have its own internal regulation constraints of how venture would kind of manage the founders. That's no longer true. The adults are no longer in charge because we no longer have an SEC or FCC or FTC. We no longer have any regulation at all. So we're running kind of an experiment in unfettered and unchecked capitalism, and we get to see what those results are.
That's Pandora's box right there in terms of opening up, especially what's happened since October of 2008. Let me keep you at part of this conversation, though, on the founder mentality. I caught a clip on your website that I had not seen, Steve Jobs talking about process versus content. And I thought that was so great. It's essentially what you were just saying, too. But the way he said that, the process versus the content, and how the people that eventually take over, for example, the ones that took over for him, they stay focused on the process and they forget the content.
You bet. That's a function of large companies managed by process people. The Jobs talk you're mentioning is worth all your listeners listening to and watching. He was essentially comparing Apple to what happened when they brought in managers from IBM, which back then, IBM in the 80s was kind of the combination of Facebook, Google, and Dropbox, and everybody rolled into one, meaning it was the gold standard. But he said what they brought in weren't the product people, they brought in the process people. And those people brought in world-class process, but they managed to kill the products because they didn't understand the products and they had no feeling of the products. They were focused on building great process. That's a trap for large companies. And what's worse is when you build process for repeatable execution. The innovators then become outliers because the existing processes no longer work for them. You need to have separate processes for innovation, or you strangle innovation with the processes that help you scale.
Let me throw this out, and not to pick on Microsoft, obviously tremendous success. When you think about how much early success they had, how much cash in the bank to see all these innovations that came after Microsoft, where you would have thought, gee, what are they doing in the lab at Microsoft? How is this stuff unfolding completely outside of Microsoft? It's always struck me, and look, I'm an outsider. You get a much closer view of the whole thing. And of course, I think it gets right at what you're getting at, which is when Steve Ballmer came in, he said, hey, we got Windows, we got Office, let's focus on the cash cow. But my gosh, the opportunity cost, all these things that came out where you would have thought they would have been at the forefront, and they just weren't. That was a decision made inside their offices. Hey, we're not doing those things.
So if you really think about it, I think the Microsoft case is instructive of capitalism in general. Under Ballmer, Microsoft revenue grew faster than it did under Gates, more profits than under Gates. The stock price did better than under Gates. So by any financial metric, Ballmer was an incredible success. Big idea. You look at the financial metrics, Wall Street and whatever, he was great. But back to your point is, because they were insisting that the world not only revolved around Windows, but they were going to defend it to death because that's what Ballmer and Gates grew up in, they missed all the other trends outside their industry. In fact, Microsoft almost went into complete irrelevance as they missed mobile, they missed search, they missed, you make the list, until the new guy came in and basically took them out of potential obscurity. I think you're seeing the same with Intel. Intel forgot what their business was. They got trapped in the fact that they were an Intel x86 architecture company and let others kind of innovate around them. They could have been ARM. In fact, they owned a piece of ARM, which was the microprocessor and architecture in every mobile device there is. Both Microsoft and Intel had another interesting characteristic is they were both rapacious monopolists. And I don't mean just in theory, as they were sued in almost every country they operated in, of crushing competition through illegal methods, which, by the way, created enormous profits for the company, the board, the investors, etc. Except for monopolists, the payback always is not pretty when technology or industry moves around them. Intel basically killed the microprocessor business around them. But in fact, it wasn't until platforms moved to phones that being the leader in desktop didn't matter. The only reason Intel's still in business actually is the fact that most of their profit now comes from data centers, meaning big iron that is using servers around the Intel architecture. Eventually that's going to go away because other architectures like NVIDIA will start chipping and AMD will start chipping away at that.
I think about Bill Gates. I saw this, I think it's on Netflix. I thought it was a great documentary with him.
Bill Gates' brain.
Yeah, I thought it was great. I mean, it's the most I've ever seen him revealed, and it just really made you, I don't know, it made me like him. I think he's been so hidden in many ways, but I thought it was great. It made me think, it's like, okay, we talk about Microsoft kind of going in this direction with the monopoly and not really innovating, but you start to wonder, well, gosh, was this just a result, now that I watched this Netflix piece, was this just the result of becoming the richest guy in the world, and perhaps you go to other interests and you don't want to keep the spring so taut your entire existence since we've only got so much time on this planet? You just wonder what would have been the motivation, because clearly he's a curious guy. Clearly he likes to solve problems and try new things. So it was interesting to see that on Netflix in parallel watching how Microsoft has gone.
I think the history of Bill Gates, when he's gone, will be written like the history of Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was a massive philanthropist who basically invented and funded most of the public libraries in the United States in the early 1900s. But his first career was he shot strikers dead in the streets in Colorado as an industrialist. Well, Gates didn't exactly shoot strikers in the streets. If you were competing with Microsoft, you were not playing with someone who knew how to play fair. And, as I said, was indicted by the U.S. government for not playing fair. What you're seeing is much like Carnegie, somebody doing good with what they gained from something the government had said wasn't too good. Most of those people don't ever own up to that about how they acquired their goods. So yes, I thought that was a wonderful kind of look at his life now. And someday someone's going to write the complete history of what his life really was.
You've just spurred many people in the audience, including me. I do recall the one book I think I had read back in the day called Hard Drive, which gave a lot of early insights into how Microsoft was initially established. And that was quite interesting, to say the least. Hey, let me keep you at something a little fun for you, because I see you do this, at least I think quite a bit. Commencement addresses. What drives you on the commencement addresses? I mean, obviously you get the invites. That's cool. That's very cool. That's never happened to me. I'm sure it must be a great feeling, but you must really just love getting up, and I can hear it in your voice, getting up and giving those inspirational insights to so many young people.
I think that's about the reason. Most people at commencement are going, okay, can we get the diploma and go home and party? And there's somebody in front of them. Can you say something interesting that they may or may not take away from them? Usually it's something that's both relevant to them and maybe something them and their parents might remember and might be useful. I kind of think of a commencement speech as kind of a 10 to 15 minute kind of learning experience, hopefully, is something I could share with them that they might want to remember.
No, I've caught several of yours. They're great. In my limited time left with you, let me keep you at a few, I don't know if they're controversial, but just interesting topics and your perspective, because you obviously have a clear perspective on Bill Gates and Microsoft. You just stated it. When I look at Facebook now, and I look at the notion of censorship, and I see this across social media platforms, where are we headed? Where is the direction going? I think as Americans, we all love the idea that we can open our mouth and say something, as long as we're not yelling fire in a crowded theater, that we can talk. That's changing. How do you feel about that?
People kind of forget is that computers kind of combine 20th century psychology and persuasion techniques, kind of like propaganda, and tie them to social need for approval and validation, like likes. Facebook actually had a growth group responsible for hacking your brain. Groups kind of reinforce beliefs and share outrage, and a small percentage can steer a group. A troll with digital bots did it or several trolls in the 2016 election. We talk about Facebook like it's some faceless entity, and we forget that there's not only Zuckerberg, but there's a board of directors that are having these conversations, and to be honest, I can't imagine they're how to make the country safer and secure. They're about how do we make our numbers every quarter. It's a public company. That's a big idea. Is again, without any regulation at all, is what you get is unfettered capitalism, even to the extent that it's damaging the country. Social media, I don't think anybody would say has now been a positive good for democracy in the United States and others. It started out with that hope, but it's kind of like reading the early hopes for what television would be it will be a way to educate people and it'll be a way to whatever. Nah, broadcast media turned out the content was just there to support the advertisers. Now that's happened with social media as well, except it now allows you to manipulate people down to a fine grain that actually generates revenue for the company, but has horrible effects on democracy and discourse.
As I've seen you say, this is ultimately coming down to, it's the conflict between money and power and the common good. And you've said this, you've kind of alluded to this several points in this conversation so far, and I have a sneaky suspicion this is something that's, as you're just outlining those points, this is at the tip of your mind most of the time, that you are very, very concerned about the capitalism that's over here that should be kind of fair and equitable and something where people can participate in and there's good coming out of it versus the common good. So there is this conflict that doesn't look good for our future, does it?
Well, the only redeeming thing about where we are right now in the country is we've been through worse times. If you know a little bit about American history, the post-Civil War era in the United States, which I kind of call flyover history, at least for me, ended at Reconstruction and carpetbaggers, and the only thing I remember, and then Teddy Roosevelt 35 years later. Well, what happened in between? Turns out it was a pretty brutal country. We did ethnic cleansing and pogroms and all kind, like, as I said, shot strikers in the street. We kind of repressed unions for 3 decades or more. We outsourced the government to corporations, believe it or not. There was no regulation. And then the pendulum swung back big time in the progressive era. It was a pretty bleak place if you were not in the mainstream of the country. We eventually will get to that swing back again. But in the meantime, it's not been great for democracy or public health or privacy or anything else. Facebook is kind of the poster child, but there are other companies like Google and others that are also running completely unfettered. And by the way, the kind of put the pieces together when we talked about founders being completely in control is Mark Zuckerberg has 60% voting control of the stock in his company. Even if his board said, you're fired, you're fired, doesn't matter, unless really something else intervened.
Complete power.
Yeah, it reaches 33 years old or 35 years old, reaches 2.5 billion people. How many people do that? But one could conclude that it's a threat to democracy, public health, privacy, even innovation. And the problem is we spent the last couple of decades, both parties, demonizing the government itself. That is, we've basically trashed this notion that there's value in any form of government regulation, where in fact that was just an extreme propaganda campaign to remove all regulation of so people could maximize revenue without any constraints. And obviously government does stupid things at stupid times. But I think we're now running the science experiment of what happens when you get rid of the EPA, we get rid of the SEC, they're still around in words, but not really in regulation. FCC, FTC, kind of gone for anything that matters. Consumer product safety, all kind of gone. Yes, people can maximize revenue, but I don't think that's good for the country for health. We're going to see those consequences in the next couple of years. When the people do kind of have an opinion, I'm not sure I'd want to be in running those companies.
I'm not really going down the path so far today. We're going to have to push people to go check out some of your work, like the Startup Owner's Manual and stuff, and really understand customer development methodology. We've gone down a lot of tangents today, but I enjoy picking your mind, and I think I was not prepared for your frankness on some of the issues. I think sometimes in this day and age, there's not many people that are willing to speak so openly, because sometimes it does feel like if you speak openly, these very entities that we're talking about could crush you. This is how we exist today as humans. We exist with a profile online. This is how we communicate. This is how we make money. And I think everyone's a little bit afraid to sometimes even speak as openly as you are right now.
Well, the good news is I'm retired. I don't need to raise money. Bill Gates is retired. I guess he could throw his money at me. And I don't mean to pick on Gates or pick on Zuckerberg or whatever. I just think or they're bored. We're just living in a time where, with no constraints, you're seeing the kind of the result of what happens when you create a society where I got mine and I'm even going to get more. Versus when I grew up, there was a notion of a more equitable society. Listen, it's not that I don't like capitalism. I'm one of the world's biggest capitalists. I got to retire as a product of the system. But I think people have made the case is how much is enough? I can't imagine if we said we're capping incomes at $100 million, the world would end. But for some people, that would be unconscionable. But if you think that there's value in having equitable society, then you would start thinking about, are there some limits? If you think it's simply Darwinian and Ayn Rand is the way we need to go, then you go, no, there's no problem at all if people own $100 billion and other people have nothing. I think that's a debate our country, our society, and people in the world are having all the time. But I think being able to have an opinion about it, the good news is we still get to do that.
Last question for you, because you've obviously thought about these things, and you just mentioned, for example, and I don't know if that was a particular plank or just an idea, with the issues that we've talked about, what kind of proposals, given your experience at looking at Silicon Valley, looking at all these startups, looking at the success, looking at the power concentrated in the hand of, for example, a 35-year-old guy reaching 2.5 billion people, what kind of solution or way to manage what has unfolded could you imagine that would be, if you were a political leader and you were to help implement, what could be done given to where we're at right now from your perspective?
Let me start with, again, my favorite phrase. That's above my pay grade. But I will tell you the danger of thinking about how to, quote, regulate this stuff is that the people who are coming up with some of the proposals of regulating business or regulating certainly innovation and entrepreneurship have never even run a lemonade stand. Those people equally scare me. It's very easy to, as you figure out how to provide some bounding boxes or the word regulation, that you don't accidentally crush innovation and entrepreneurship at the same time. It is possible to come up with reasonable systems that allow both to happen, but they can't be designed by people who've never actually, as I said, run a lemonade stand as we run a business. The problem is of course, that on the other side, you're always finding people who figure out how to game the system. Regulation has now become a dirty word in the United States. It makes people cringe, and that's because they've been conditioned by people who want no regulation, who want to, in fact, game the system. And I think finding a balance between allowing innovation, entrepreneurship, and capitalism to thrive in a world that kind of everybody gets to share in the bounty should be a goal. That's not what we got today. And I find that a little discouraging, but I and others are going to spend some of our time helping I mean, I spend my time now helping the country figure out in the places that need it to do innovation and entrepreneurship, and also spend a lot of time thinking about how we could build a more equitable and just society, not just for Silicon Valley and the clusters on the coast, but across the country.
I can easily imagine a scenario in the near future where we have America's first trillionaire, while at the same time, perhaps 75% of America does not have $1,000 in the bank. I like to think of myself as the biggest capitalist too, and I would probably be one of these people that would, in the past, would argue about, hey, the government's too tight on things. But if we reached the point where there was the first trillionaire, at the same time, 75% of the country literally had no money, that's just terrible.
Well, obviously not terrible enough for the people who have their thumb on the scale. As I said, we've gone through this cycle in the United States once before, and eventually that arc swung back to maybe something more equitable in the middle of the 20th century. This is the world I grew up in, when there was a strong middle class, when you could see the top from the bottom, and vice versa. It's just not the case.
Steve, I thank you for taking some time today. Again, we have not dived into some of your great insights on, for example, customer development methodology. And people are going to have to go dig in. One of your books, A Startup Owner's Manual, a step-by-step guide for building a great company. What website can we direct people to? Where would you like to send people to?
So if people want to swim through a sea of innovation entrepreneurship, there's a website called steveblank.com, Steve, BLANK.com. And you can find all my work on innovation entrepreneurship. And there's also a tab called The Secret History of Silicon Valley that might be of interest to some people wanting to know how it all started.
Steve, great stuff. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you for your time.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.